Okay. Thank you all for coming. Let me welcome you most warmly at the panel, Mrs. Dalloway, Consciousness, Communion, Community. To encourage conversation and to reduce our increasing Zoom fatigue, we will have a short break after each 15-minute presentation. The papers will be followed then by questions and answers, so our speaker will have a lot of time, I hope, to address all questions that arise during the session. We have a wonderful chat moderator, Reilly Smith, so you may post any questions or comments for our speakers in the chat at any time, okay? And let me introduce our first speaker. Georgy Liseyev was born in Moscow, Russia in 1998. In 2019, he received his bachelor degree in journalism from Moscow State University, where he studied literary, cinema, and art criticism. After that, he moved to the Faculty of Humanities in the Higher School of Economics, Moscow. This is his current affiliation, where he acquired his master's degree in comparative literature in 2021 with a thesis on Virginia Woolf, specifically on the subject of emotional communities that he's going to talk on today in Mrs. Dalloway. Nowadays, he continues his studies as a postgraduate student in the Doctoral School of Philology in the Higher School of Economics and works on his PhD thesis, which precedes and expands his master's work. His research interests include Virginia Woolf, modernist literature, history of emotions, modern drama, and film studies. The title of his paper is Emotional Communities in Mrs. Dalloway. Georgy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paulina. And before I start, I just wanted to say, like a little reminder for all of us, I, as a citizen of Russia and who still lives there, I wanted just to say about the catastrophic war that still is going in Europe. And me, as a citizen of Russia, of course, I feel a little, maybe not a little, but responsibility for what is happening. But and of course, I'm more than against this war, and just wanted to say that I'm grateful that I can have an opportunity to talk with you today and have a contact with our world in a friendly way, and to show that in Russia still are people that are against this awful war. And now I just want to, unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I can share with you my text in a Word file. Yes.
I just want to break in for a second to tell you that a lot of hearts has appeared on the screen, and we all feel with you on that way. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And unfortunately, in some way, in some sense, the theme of my paper is also connected with war, not directly, but in some sense, because as we remember, Mrs. Dalloway stops on the time after war in Europe. And to start with, I just wanted to focus on the name of my paper. It is Emotional Communities. And what is emotional communities? Let's try to understand this. To understand this, we need to apply to the popular area of humanities today, which is called history of emotions, and is actively developing, especially in American academia. The concept of emotional communities was firstly used and defined by an American historian, Professor Emerita at Loyola University, Chicago, Barbara H. Rosenwein, in her 2002 essay, Worrying About Emotions in History, where she wrote, "People lived and live in what I propose to call emotional communities. These are precisely the same as social communities, families, neighborhoods, parliaments, guilds, monasteries, parish church memberships, but the researcher, looking at them, seeks above all to uncover systems of feeling, what these communities and individuals within them define and assess as valuable or harmful to them. The evaluation that they make about others' emotions, the nature of the affective bonds between people that they recognize, and the modes of emotional expression that they expect, encourage, tolerate, and deplore. Later, she developed this concept in the 2006 book, Emotional Communities in the Early Middle Ages, where she thoroughly analyzed different communities of a specific historical period regarding their systems of feeling. In that book, Barbara H. Rosenwein expanded the definition of emotional communities using the metaphor of a circle. Imagine then a large circle within which are smaller circles, not entirely concentric, but rather distributed unevenly with the given space. The large circle is the overarching emotional community, tied together by fundamental assumptions, values, goals, feeling rules, and accepted modes of expression. The smaller circles represent subordinate emotional communities, partaking in the larger one and revealing its possibilities and its limitations. They too may be subdivided. At the same time, other large circles may exist, either entirely isolated from or intersecting with the first at one or more points. So as we see, there could be lots of emotional communities, and different people could be in different emotional communities and move from one to another. Besides, Professor Rosenwein divided emotional communities into two possible groups: social, which assumes a group of people with close personal contacts, and textual, in which people could not even know each other and are linked through some sort of text or media. German historian Jan Plumper, who wrote a book about history of the emotions, praises the positive aspects of the method in these words: the conception of emotional communities is an attractive way of approaching the way in which emotional bonds are formed and reproduced. It avoids the individualizing trap of psychohistory, which never succeeded in making the leap from the individual to the collective. Of course, the concept of Professor Rosenwein has its flaws and received some reasonable criticism. It is also quite, the conception is also quite new and is not universally claimed, leading a competition with some other theories, as for example, William Brady's theory of emotional regimes. That is a very interesting field in the history of emotion studies, but for now, we don't have time to analyze all of this, and I would like to move further and try to explain why this term seems to me so applicable for analysis of literature, particularly Virginia Woolf, and most of all her famous novel, Mrs. Dalloway. To start with, I should say that in my analysis of Mrs. Dalloway through the conception of emotional communities, I use this term with a necessary shift in its original meaning. It is clear that to get to the conclusion how the emotional communities of people functioned in a specific historical period, Barbara Rosenwein and her other fellow historians analyze documentary types of texts, while we have to work with radical for literature history, but at the same time, quite traditional fiction. Historical emotional communities could be named, using Benedict Anderson's terminology, imagined communities reconstructed by a historian, while in fiction, they are also imagined and constructed, but by an author. And so, as a result, could be more free, unlimited, and in some sense, truly emotional, because literature, especially fiction, unlike history, has always been focused on people's emotions, not less and often even more than on social aspects. Just one comparative example. In the introduction of her most prominent book about emotional communities, Barbara H. Rosenwein writes, "Whether overarching or subordinate, emotional communities are not coterminous with just any group. A crowded street does not constitute an emotional community. An emotional community is a group in which people have a common stake, interests, values, and goals." Some of us can argue with that, but it seems true. In real life, we could speak of spontaneous crowds as emotional communities only in regard to special occasions like crowd in theater or on a stadium, where groups of people who do not know each other could share almost similar emotions with each other. But what do we see in the famous opening part of Woolf's novel, where Mrs. Dalloway hears a pistol shot on the street outside, which turns out as a sound of a motor car? Right here happens this leap from individual to the collective, which in my opinion is a great description of the novel's plot and structure. Describing the collective emotion of the street crowd towards the motor car, with the queen, prince, or prime minister sitting in it and symbolizing authority, greatness, and finally the whole empire, Virginia Woolf shows how these complex emotions caused by the mysterious car spread invisibly and inaudibly from group to group in the streets of London, and as a result, connect all these different peoples on the emotional level. Moreover, in the same episode, we remember how we see how the collective emotions could transform almost imperceptibly and rapidly switch to another subject, the aeroplane, which is advertising toffee. This type of communities, which we can all we can call spontaneous, is, I believe, the most obvious example of how emotional communities work in Mrs. Dalloway, but not the only one. In my opinion, the opening novel episode with Mrs. Dalloway in the streets of London, with a detailed description of her emotions about nature, people, and her past, is absolutely intentionally succeeded by the description of collective emotions. One of the key themes of the novel to me is a difficult but gradual process of shaping and building a net of emotional communities, which in the end unites in kind of a utopian social structure, emotional structure. What are the other emotional communities in Mrs. Dalloway? I believe we can divide them in two groups, spontaneous and sustained, each of which also could be divided in macro, micro, and medium types of communities, depending on their size. The spontaneous ones probably could not exist in history or real life, while fiction, and especially modernist type of fiction, which Virginia Woolf conducts in her novels, creates a space and opportunity for all random, fleeting, accidental, and evanescent connections between people to live and influence the world. In Mrs. Dalloway, this sort of emotional connections between characters makes up one of the most significant parts of the text. Especially strong in the novel, in my opinion, are the emotional connections between only two people, which however form this invisible and at first sight insignificant, spontaneous, emotional micro-communities. It's important to know that all of these communities are not equal in the level of their emotional bond. For example, Scrooge Purvis, right from the beginning of the novel, just throws a brief glance at Clarissa while she even does not see him. But even this connection, I believe, could be considered as a form of an emotional impulse that does not form a real community, but becomes a base for further interconnections between the characters in the novel. Besides, this glance makes a rhyme with the final sight of Peter Walsh on Clarissa, with which the novel ends. And as for Peter and Clarissa, they obviously form a sustained emotional micro-community, only of their two, which through all the novel have lots of emotional conflicts, but finally the bond has been made. Other sustained emotional communities in the novel that we can distinguish are, to name some of them, the Dalloway family, Clarissa and the servants, the Borton community, Septimus and Retzia, Miss Kilman and Elizabeth, Lady Bruton's circle, and the circle of British aristocracy and political elite who becomes the guests of Mrs. Dalloway's party. And that's, of course, not all, but maybe just some of the most important. And here is the important to me and paradoxical part, which makes the use of the conception of emotional communities for me so productive. All these sustained communities are at the same time social and emotional in the Barbara Rosenwein sense. They have some emotional rules according to which they live in these groups. Live in these groups. But referring to the text, we would clearly see that each of these communities on a social level does not work properly. Dalloway family, Clarissa and Richard have lots of unsolved and unspoken problems, and it would be hard to call them a happy family in a social sense. Septimus and Retzia, of course, also not, because they make each other's lives kind of hell. British aristocracy, also not, because almost all the party scene could be read as a satire, and especially in the social sense. But what happens if we watch on all these communities only on the emotional level? To me, there is the answer. Speaking of invisible and inarticulate emotions, Richard and Clarissa truly love each other. Septimus and Retzia feel the strongest bond, especially in the scene right before his suicide. And even the British aristocracy becomes more humane when we will read the scene of a party regarding the emotional atmosphere created there by Mrs. Dalloway. And also, what I wanted to add, that this scene of a party, the paradox of this scene is the maybe social type of connections is actually these are alienated people, but on the emotional level, right there becomes this bond between Mrs. Dalloway and Septimus, right on the party. And as a result, for me, using the concept of emotional communities in analyzing the novel by Virginia Woolf, we could see how all the novel structure is built on these microscopic emotional bonds between the characters, and how in the end it makes the world of the novel not alienated, but truly connected. And that's all. That's all for now. Would like to answer the questions after.
Absolutely. Thank you for an inspiring presentation. It was wonderful to hear your paper. Thank you so much. And let us move to our next speaker, who is Mridula Sharma. Mridula Sharma has published over 20 journal articles and book chapters in edited anthologies published by Routledge University of Delaware Press and Vernon Press, among others. She has secured scholarships and grants for her work by institutions in Germany, England, India, and the US. Her research interests include critical theory, modernity, and pedagogy. The title of her paper is Ethics and Authority in Mrs. Dalloway, Contradiction, Communal, and Reading. Mridula, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'll now start with my presentation, but before that, I'll make a very quick confession, which is that almost an hour before the presentation, I realized that the document that I prepared for it is basically, well, it was not to be located anymore on my laptop. So I ended up sort of writing down some things quickly that may make me help complete the presentation today. So am I intimidated to present in front of 22 people right now? Yes, I am. And I may actually end up completing this presentation before 15 minutes. So I just wanted to share that before I begin. All right, so today I just hope to examine narrative indeterminacy in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway through conflicting modes of interpretation. So essentially, I argue that Woolf's recognition of what James Joyce calls authority ultimately serves a self-serving purpose. Joyce's self-critical neologism implies his recognition of how an uncritical reading of a text can submit the readers to the author's authority. And authority designates the system through which meaning is defined and legislated, usually by someone or something that's perceived to be exempt from its own laws. Now, the word authority reinforces the logic of authorial authority as it conditions the author's recognition of the problem of superiority with self-serving vocabularies of redemption. So in advocating for a death right, one that is influenced by the logic of equality, it triggers unraveling possibilities of its discourse that effectively unsettle the axiomatics upon which it decisively founds itself. So as a result, in textualizing and intellectualizing her recognition of her authorial authority, Woolf deliberately traverses disciplinary spaces of the critical and the creative and arrogates unto herself yet another form of legitimation. And yet at the same time, Indeterminacy simultaneously evinces certain forms of attention and empathy in its attempt to cultivate intersubjective relations among individuals, which is what we find in feminist epistemology and the theorization of ethics by Levinas. So before I talk about that, I just want to read out a certain paragraph from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. I think this is an important one, so I'll just quickly try to walk through it. I quote, "Her only gift was knowing people almost by instinct," she thought, walking on. If you put her in a room with someone, up went her back like a cat's, or she purred. Devonshire House, Bath House, the house with the china cockatoo, she had seen them all lit up once, and remembered Sylvia, Fred, Sally Seton, such hosts of people, and dancing all night, and the wagons plodding past to market, and driving home across the park. She remembered once throwing a shilling into the Serpentine, but everyone remembered. What she loved was this, here, now, in front of her, the fat lady in the cap. Now, Clarissa's gift of knowing people extends a claim to instinctive knowledge. It drives us toward epistemic humility and justice, making us acknowledge the need to listen to and learn from each other. Perhaps we can perceive this as a humble inclusion of the experiences of people who don't have the privilege that she has. Besides, the fact that Clarissa knows people by instinct in her encounters positions them as sources of legitimate knowledge and inquiry, and conveys the importance of interdependence in the act of knowledge production. So, the co production of knowledge and a shift to experiential knowledge is precisely what feminist epistemology stands for. Now, Emmanuel Levinas similarly situates ethics in one's relationship to the other person. What interests him is the intersubjective relation with the other human. So, this ethical relation is the reverse of violence and dehumanization, since it constitutes the acknowledgement of the other's humanity. It situates itself in opposition to traditional ontology and the privilege of knowledge in Western philosophy that always reduces the other to a principle of identity or the same. Levinas aims at reversing the traditional hierarchy that reduces ethics to a branch of ontology and epistemology by seeking to raise ethics to the level of first philosophy. He places the primacy of epistemology and ontology over ethics into question. So epistemology and ontology, as defining the entirety of Western philosophy, is a thought of the same, a thought that reduces otherness to the same by the very power of its theoretical comprehensiveness. So for him, theory is a mode to approach the known being in such a way that its otherness in relation to the knowing being vanishes. So in the traditional philosophical correlation between knowledge and being, knowledge represents an activity that appropriates and comprehends the alterity of what is known. Consequently, Western philosophy has often been an epistemology and an ontology, which is to say a reduction of the other to the same. Opposed to the tradition of Western thought, Levinas attempts to go beyond being and to overcome ontology by moving beyond being towards the other, beyond ontology towards ethics. Returning to the paragraph from Woolf's text that I cited earlier, we don't understand the traditional ontology as a knowledge of being in general, because in such a context, beings emerge against a backdrop that exceeds them, since the individual cases against the background of the concept. So like Levinas, for whom the other entity par excellence is the other person, the other human, Clarissa too expresses an investment in undeconstructed humanism, in maintaining a relationship with and a responsibility to the other through her instinctive knowledge. She seeks to give humanism a new foundation, one which foregrounds ethics. So I'll now return to the same paragraph and complete the last few lines. I quote, "Did it matter then," she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street, "did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it, or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely, but that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other, she being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling all to bits and pieces as it was, part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist, but it spread ever so far, her life herself. So if we look at Heidegger's work, primarily that in which he conceptualizes mindness, we see that he ends up establishing how one's death is only one's death and one's death alone. And let me rephrase that in first person. So according to Heidegger, my death is only my death and my death alone. And in doing so, he radically individuates the existent. The others fade in the authentic assumption of death is only one's own. Now, Woolf follows Levinas when she challenges this egoistic death and opposes it to a death that would be much more primordial, such as the death of the other. The death of the other is for her the first death. So she demands that the I should be concerned for the other before any self-concern. But yet, at the same time, she also demands that the other is concerned for the I before any collective concern. Now, the assessment of authority and ethics in Mrs. Dalloway's narrative organization in a way helps us locate opposing reading experiences of narrative practice in dialogues on command and care. In the remaining part of my presentation, I hope to turn to the question of ethics and reading and ethics in reading as I turn to a certain question raised by Vicky Mahaffey in her interesting book titled Modernist Literature. So she poses this question, which is, what are the social implications of a communal desire to read and understand quickly and easily? Now, I bring up this question for one primary reason. The conception of communion by Levinas and Woolf's approach to being and its illustration of the communion help us think of new ways of approaching togetherness. Modernist literature, which invests itself in seeking unique modes of articulating the individual's relation with surrounding entities, now faces a threat of, well, in a way, boycott. Now, Mahaffey points out how the conclusion that James Joyce's Ulysses was the most important text in the 20th century was shortly followed by a popular poll that ascribed that title to Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. This raises the urgent need of not only assessing canon formations occurring outside the academy, but also seriously examining the logic in which the process embeds itself. Now, Mahaffey's question is an important one since it forces us to consider that public demand of popular literature can perhaps pose it a different form of an exclusionary threat to modernist literature. Voice is an important tool for expression, used literally and figuratively through history to disseminate knowledge, maintain narratives, protest and disrupt systems of control, and share the myths and legends that sustain our communities. Neglect of modernist literature and its investment in creating new voices presents a new challenge. If voice is that helps us to engage with our rights or the power to take part in global conversations around politics and social issues, what happens when it's taken away? Debates on popular literature tend to express a certain sense of frustration with canons that inscribe and maintain their own credibility thanks to approval legislated or rather institutionalized by concerned stakeholders. Many redeem popular literature from allegations of thematic limitations by uncovering interpretative possibilities in the text and examining social implications of the text. Now, that the fact that such dialogues often begin with the defense of popular literature's critical value confirms how the popular gets perceived as an overlooked category, a category whose redemption can counter the hegemony of dominant canons by providing us with a subversive alternative. Now, Mahaffey discusses the public dismissal of modernist literature due to the difficulty that it poses to quick comprehension. So in a way, perhaps we can, in fact, conceptualize canons outside the spaces of classrooms. And if popular fiction tends to be overlooked in academia, modernist fiction can be ignored outside it, or in fact is being ignored outside it. I want to end with a question, which is that if we can theorize canon formation outside the academy, we must also compare the varying forms of legitimacy to academic and popular canons. And so in that context, how do space and time, and when I say space, I'm talking about geographic, cultural, and intellectual. So how do space and time affect such a conversation? So I'll end with that. Thank you so much.
That was impressive. Thank you so much. So, Richie, laced with many philosophical insights. Thank you very much for the paper. I think that we will now take a little break, okay, to process the paper that we have just heard. So 15:35, we will have the third speaker, Tong. Okay, so I'm very much looking forward to the presentation of our third speaker, Tong. Tong, are you with us? Can we see you, maybe? Or can we hear you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful, thank you. So Tong is a PhD candidate of British and American Literature in the School of Arts and Humanities, University of Texas at Dallas. She has updated her paper, so the title is slightly different than in the program, which is absolutely fine because I think that we are all inspired by this event and it happens very often. Okay, so the title is now Spatial Subjection and Street Consciousness in Mrs. Dalloway. So Tong, the floor is yours, and we wait.
Thank you, Paula. I apologize for changing my title in the very last minute. However, the core concept, street consciousness, remains the same. So I also sent a fuller version of the conference paper in the chat. So you all conducted that while during my presentation. So let me start with the introduction first. Althusser uses a common street scene to show how one becomes a subject in modern society. One city worker hears a hail, "Hey, you there," from the policeman, and upon hearing it, the hailed individual turns round, quote, mere 180-degree physical conversion, he becomes a subject, end quote, as Althusser states. Wolff's portrait of a three-character city experience takes from there, but with a slight twist. Instead of illustrating actual figure as the agent of institutional power, or to use Althusser's term, the ideological state apparatuses, Wolff's narrative highlights the physical space of various city locales to review a spatial operation of ideology in producing proper subjects of nation state. Critics note this subjection among Wolff's character living in London. However, many read London as a setting to contextualize the subjugation of the individuals by the state power, taking for granted that the city is a neutral space. Recent studies approach Wolff's novels by examining certain unique spaces in her works, such as room, attic, threshold, or omnibus. My analysis here develops from this inquiry into her spatial politics as well as poetics, but diverts itself by focusing on the dynamic between the self and the city. As you would see from the last 2 points here on this slide, the rest of my presentation will firstly touch upon the three street scenes: Clarissa in Bond Street, Peter in Whitehall, Septimus in Regent's Park, and then end with the discussion of street consciousness as which proposes a human subjectivity through space. So for Clarissa, being an insider of the city, she has no problem calling herself a Londoner. She feels at ease when she works from home to buy her flowers in Bond Street because she knows this is her neighborhood, this is her place. She doesn't see herself as a stranger in Bond Street, but a person with a sense of intimacy to this space. She is an insider aligning with the ruling class in the power structure in parallel with her location in the city. Apart from being a commercial space, Bond Street is also highlighted by the presence of royal authority. In other words, Bond Street not only displays commodities, but also connotative signs of state power. The car carrying a royal member backfires in this street is not a coincidence. In fact, the identity of this member is not important at all, for the external narrator makes such a comment, as you will see from the slide here. The car is a sign of greatness, displaying state power and national pride. And upon seeing this sign, Clarissa wears, quote, a look of extreme dignity, end quote, with the appearance of this signifier of royal authority. Those interpreting this sign of greatness turn to the hill from the state. Then upon this turning round, they are more than regular customers or consumers in the space, but become the interpolated subjects under the spatial operation by a state signifier. Among them, Clarissa is no exception. And then I will just talk about Peter in Whitehall. So returning from a 5-year service in India, Peter negotiates his Englishness in the metropole with a shadow presence of the colony. He's caught up between here and there while admiring the industrial automobile on the street. He's simultaneously thinking about his own invention, the agricultural tools for the so-called coolies back in India. Meanwhile, he's also caught up between two married women, Clarissa in Dalloway, Clarissa in London and Daisy in India. To some extent, these two women function as kind of a metonyms of England and India in Peter's conception. Peter constructs his English self through a juxtaposition of the urban center and the rural periphery. In short, he cannot be himself without his India. Apart from the connotations of the British Empire, Peter is also drawn to the ideological interpolation performed by the city memorials, particularly the military statues along Whitehall. As you can see from the first quote here, these statues are reminders of war heroes, helping to enforce a sense of national pride among the public. The young citizens like Peter are easily held by the ideology of nationalism behind these signifiers of state. Standing under Gordon's statue, Peter recalls, quote, Gordon, whom as a boy he had worshipped, end quote. As a subject of state, Peter takes pride in serving the army and sees the tradition continues from him from Gordon to him, and now to the young men who are ready to join the army and to serve the country, as you will read the next quote here on the slide. Boys in uniform, carrying guns. So Peter recognizes the spatial subjection coming from the statues as he laments, quote, life with its varieties, its reticences had been laid under a pavement of monuments and wreathed and dragged onto a stiff yet staring corpse by discipline, end quote. No matter how different each boy may be, they go through maturity by becoming the disciplined subject to serve the country. And then for Septimus, coming from a small town, he regards London as a place for his possibility to become a poet. However, he is quickly consumed by its national building and becomes the first joining the army to fight the war. Then he returns from the battlefield. He can no longer fit in as a desired subject of the state because of his shell shock. He is diagnosed by medical professional Sir William Bradshaw as a subject out of proportion. We've carefully formed a parallel here. While the nature must be regulated and contained, like the plants in the park, Septimus is deemed by the state as an improper subject to be regulated and contained as well. In Regent's Park, Septimus identifies himself more with nature than human nature. He can communicate with the natural world, but cannot feel anything in the human world. He relies on his wife as the mediator between him and others. As the green space in the city, the park is designed as a common space for city dwellers to rest and interact with the nature. However, instead of restoring Septimus' mental state, Regent's Park triggers his so-called madness as he completely ignores his wife and interacts with the pattern of the nature, as you will read from the quote here on the slide. Through Septimus' perception, the nature is talking to him excitedly, full of energy and vitality, and he, being part of that organic unity, can talk back to the leaves and trees. This wave-like pattern is an indication of being alive, and Septimus feels alive when he connects with this moving pattern. The rising and falling motion also suggests the intensity of the self-reflexive activity in his mind. To Septimus, moving with the pattern of the nature is him speaking his language, which is regarded as ravings in medical discourse. And lastly, I just need to talk something about street consciousness as well. So if our user is right that, quote, all ideology hails or interpolates concrete individuals as concrete subjects, end quote, then by assigning Clarissa to the commercial space, Peter to the political space, and Septimus to the green space of the city, Wolff underlines the significance of spatial operations within the adducery interpolation. Meanwhile, by presenting how the three characters' subject formation is affected spatially in London, Wolff shows that the cityscape of London, such as Bond Street, Whitehall, and Regent's Park, is unevenly registered with mixed ideologies. Among them, Wolff is particularly aware of the ideological boundary between the interiority and exteriority in articulating human subjectivity. While revealing the spatial subjection within the city landscape, Wolff also puts a question mark to the interpolated subject. Indeed, we are interpolated by ideology, but how much or how long can it hold our self-consciousness in place? There are moments of characters feeling free from the limits of their physical existence in the form of flashback, fantasy, and frenzy. This fleeing consciousness demonstrates the difficulties in pinning down the self into its subject position. To be more precise, the flowing consciousness is deeply grounded in the spreading streets of the city, and I addressed it as street consciousness. Wolff's street consciousness proposes a thinking of subjectivity through space, as she perceives a change in humanity. Woolf writes in Character in Fiction, quote, on or about December 1910, human character changed, end quote. She further describes the change in a comparison as such, which is the first quote here on the slide. The in and out shows Woolf's effort to turn human subjectivity inside out, and the effort reveals itself in the use of street consciousness in Mrs. Dalloway, primarily in the character Clarissa. There's a scene vividly illustrating the articulation of such consciousness, which is the second quote here on the slide here. And I found it interesting because Mridula also used this quote here. From the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, Clarissa senses a different form of existence, which is quite different from the Cartesian cogito. This feeling of being here and there, along with the self-knowledge of being part of the nature as well as the people she had never met, constitute a mode of subjectivity that the self doesn't occupy the privileged ontological position as a subject in Descartes' formula, I think, therefore I am. The line between the subject and the object becomes porous, which renders I slippery and mobile. In other words, the self is hard to pin down in a fixed position, but rather spreads like a mist that may be transitory yet pervasive. Quote, she would not say of herself, I am this, I am that, end quote. What Clarissa perceives here presents a changing relationship between consciousness and the city, self, and other, and at a discourse level, anticipates a knowledge of subjectivity that revises the Cartesian notion of the subject as a self-contained and autonomous. Woolf inserts her understanding of human subjectivity in Clarissa's street consciousness, which accentuates upon a dispersed self rather than instead of a centered self. Some argue this alternative vision as an extension of the boundary of the self. I think rather than an extension, it aims at a porous interface separating self and other, interiority and exteriority. As Peter remembers, Clarissa's conceptualization of herself this way, quote, she felt herself everywhere, not here, 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 but everywhere. So to know her or anyone, one must seek out the people who completed them, even the places, end quote. Thus, through street consciousness, the stability and the security of a subject's subjectivity under social identity is under scrutiny as Woolf presents a mind map of her city dwellers. Woolf scholars agreed with this fluidity of Woolf's representation of individuals' consciousness in this novel, but it is also noticeable that this representation is firmly grounded in London's cityscape. The human consciousness is not that private as it pours out onto the city streets, attaching itself to various locales of the city. In a reciprocal way, Woolf's London is not that public as it constitutes of personal thoughts, emotions, and memories. As a result, with one's consciousness permeating outwardly, the writing of cityscape is also a writing of human subjectivity to some extent. In this sense, street consciousness is also a form of transgression which disrupts the line dividing interiority and exteriority in representing subjectivity. And the last slide should be my words cited. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful paper. And the presentation was so helpful with also following your ideas. And I think that this material and spiritual or psychological aspects were also interwoven there. So thank you so much. Okay, so we can start now the conversation. We can wait for about a minute or two if you wish to process once again the last paper, okay? And I think that at 15:55, we can start the discussion, we can start the conversation, okay? I'm looking forward to questions. Either you can put them in the chat if you prefer that version, or you can, of course, ask them aloud. If you wish, you may use the raise your hand button if that helps. We know then that you wish to share with us your questions. So looking forward to a discussion. We have 2 minutes to start it.
Yeah, actually, can I yes?
Yes, absolutely.
Also,
I'm looking
yeah.
at the comment in the chat that you probably want to respond. Absolutely.
Yeah, Tanya is very right, and actually, yes, it's kind of a theme that really connects with my life, and I think not only mine, because, for example, yes, when I just 2 days ago, when I for the first time, I'm here on this conference for the first time. So at first day, I participate in the social hour, and all of the people were so kind to me, and I thought, well, how Wolf with her really emotional prose, and this my idea that there are lots of emotional communities, how it connects with life, and also this conference. So it really really is very connected.
Absolutely.
And in some sense, I believe that Bloomsbury Group was a real emotional community in lots of senses. So yeah, and I think that is very about her.
Okay, so thank you very much for that wonderful beginning and for creation of emotional community here. Let us start. I see that we have a question. Gwen, could you ask yours, please?
Absolutely. So thank you to all the presenters. Those are wonderful papers. This question is for Tong and Georgy, I think. I was seeing some connection, I think, between both this description of emotional communities and the way that Tong was describing how certain activities on the street would sort of diffract that individual consciousness into more of a collective, right? I'm wondering, and I'm thinking of that quote Tong was sharing as well, the ebb and flow. I'm sort of picturing the circles growing and shrinking. And, you know, are there other parts of the novel where maybe we see that happening? Do we see the street consciousness extending into the private realm, or maybe into the past, where Clarissa and Peter are sort of reflecting on their past together? Do we see those emotional communities interlocking, even like circles that are connecting even at times? It's a pretty vague question, I'm sorry, but if either of you want to respond to that.
I could start, Tong, but okay, yeah, because I've just that is my problem, that I had lots of idea, but maybe did not tell every of what I wanted to tell. But now maybe it is a good time to add something, and that's a really good question. Thank you, Gwen. Yes, to me the two most important metaphors in the novel, metaphors of connection, of forming and building a community, is a metaphor of a circle, as you mentioned and Tong mentioned. And also, I think it is a metaphor of thread and a spider. There is a moment when, after Lady Bruton's lunch, she and this lunch is also a bit satirical in a social sense. Their connections are they're a bit hypocritical towards each other, as we understand. But after the lunch, Lady Bruton sits and she dreams about her youth, and this dream, and from this dream she gets some empathy to all to her friends, to all people, even as I remember, if I remember, to all this nature, something like Clarissa actually feels in the beginning. So that passage is of feelings of Lady Bruton is a bit similar to me, and there is this metaphor of a spider, as I could maybe yes, a spider's thread. Yeah, that's right. And the spider's thread and Virginia Woolf's. It's interesting that this spider's thread, it goes as a metaphor from Lady Bruton to Richard, and then also as a metaphor from Richard to Clarissa. So this thread connects also this maybe emotional community of these three people, which also have some conflicts and some problems, but on the emotional level, on the level of this metaphor of the spider's thread, they are also connected. What I wanted to say. Maybe Tong have something to add.
I think you add a perfect example here about the spider's web, because I was just thinking about it as well, because I feel like Lady Bruton, like, well, if like incorporating my kind of like a term, the street consciousness, like she has this kind of, by saying she sitting in the web, center of her web, and having this attachment, the thread growing thinner and thinner, because her luncheon guest, Peter and Richard, also goes far from him. So that's kind of like a growing thinner and thinner. This spatial metaphor is also kind of like function as a street consciousness as well, to me, in my understanding. So I'm just glad that you brought this example. And also, I guess, just to address the question, I guess, there is another thing. I find it like there is that the so-called like liberating, or more about the street consciousness, do not necessarily happen to each one of them. I guess it only happens to certain characters when they actually test out this boundary between interiority and exteriority. So I guess it's momentary. And also, I feel like actually in my fuller version of the paper, I also discuss about if we actually look into this kind of a mode of writing or mode of narrative device as street consciousness, and I think it developed more further in Woolf's another article called Street Haunting. So you will see clearly about this kind of a growing thinner and like this sizable, and also this kind of a transmitting connection between like different dwellers among while walking on the streets. So I guess that's just some supplement there to the question. I hope I answered it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for a wonderful addition to what you have said in your papers already. We have also a fascinating discussion in the chat. First of all, Gwen has elaborated on their metaphor here of interlocking rings, which I think rings the bell also with me after listening to these papers. And we have a response from Rachel Crosslands, who also thought about this sound quality of wolf works that we are all so well familiar with. So the circle of the Big Band, does it follow your interpretations in case of all three speakers, if I may ask? Okay. So do we have the sound quality as a connecting factor?
Yes, I'm not sure how I could elaborate on that, but yes, and as I understand, yes, the sound quality is connected with the metaphor of a circle also, and so yes, the sound is just another aspect of this metaphor for me. Yeah, as I think so.
I can think of like an example just to add that about the soundscape, like because during the research about this kind of or the portrait of landscape involves Mrs. Dalloway, like there is article examining this soundscape of the city. So you will, as we're all familiar with, right, like other than Big Bang, we have other sounds like serving as this kind of a chronological order there to lead the readers through this day. And also, I think there's one example of Elizabeth. She actually gets off the bus on the streets and joining this marching crowd. And also she gains a kind of a different idea of herself, what she could be. She could be a farmer, she could be a lawyer or something, by this kind of uproar on the street, which is not exactly about the Big Band, the timing, but about this crowded and also this kind of a feeling of working, people working, is like having an occupation. So I guess that could be an example to the kind of the sound quality.
Also, I remembered, of course, the sound of the sea. That is kind of a bit mystical. Yes, we don't understand which sea. Yes, but it's kind of also it is connected, as I understand, with the dream, with the motif of the dream, and the sound of the sea. It goes with accompanies motif of the dream. So yeah, yes, of course, and of course there are lots of sounds that we maybe did not mention, but they also play this role of connecting people.
Mridula, do you see these interconnections also in your research, in your analysis? Can you tell us a few words?
Yeah, so I think if I look back at the comment that was posted more recently, the one on the role of the state in capitalism and emotional communities, I'm not necessarily sure if it adds on to what I've been talking about, but the earlier conversation about, yeah, it did in a way link with my conversation on the communion, because I feel that even Wolf goes on to just build these new relations to the other, which is not just a being together in a shared world, but a kind of an encounter with the other that's more face to face. So it's the immediate encounter without necessarily the intermediary. So I think that kind of an encounter also helps us think of a new kind of a responsibility for the other, one which is much more non-reactive reciprocal and non-chosen, and also at the same time infinite. So I think certain concerns of reciprocity in contracts and agreements with other are kind of similarities that I see in the works of Levinas and Wolf, and I think that may sort of add on to the conversation that has already been happening here.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you about Levinas, but I see that we have two fascinating questions in the chat waiting. So shall we start with Tanya? Tanya, would you like to ask your question, or should I read it, as you prefer?
I can ask it.
Wonderful.
I usually will think of emotional communities as a positive thing. And here we have these two spontaneous emotional communities that come together through the car, which is an agent of nationalism, and the airplane, which is an agent of capitalism. And I'm just curious what role this plays in emotional communities, and if either of you have anything to say about what that says about these types of communities.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Of course, yeah, communities. Of course, communities. We are used to think of them as only positive, but this is a kind of problematic, and maybe I'm not sure, because maybe I had not yet also revealed this idea, but thank you for it. But maybe if I'll try to spontaneously think about something. Yes, maybe Virginia Woolf shows truly different types of emotional communities, and in some of them there is no empathy, and like in the community which is formed with around the car or airplane, and that's a kind of communities which are formed just through a cause, non-emotional cause, just emotional, but some outer cause, like a car on or airplane, and empire or capitalism, and there is no empathy in this community, and it is formed without empathy. And but the other examples in the novel that we see, yes, they could be also in some sorts. They have problems, they have conflicts, but finally there is empathy, and even I actually did not say about it, but even this very difficult micro community, as I say it, between Mrs. Dalloway and Miss Kilman. Of course, it's very it's full of hatred, full of but at the scene of the party, yes, we remember how Mrs. Dalloway thinks, I hate her. Oh, she hates her, but then she loves her. And why? I think that love, from where it came from, the empathy of Mrs. Dalloway, that she does everything to understand the person that is even the person that is so different from her, and so has such a negative attitude towards her. And so we see some empathetic communities that are positive, yeah, and some non-empathetic, which are negative. That's why that's how I think about it in this moment.
Okay, thank you so much. Tong, Mridula, would you like to add something? Though the question on spontaneous emotional communities probably was mostly centered for Georgy, but maybe you would like to step in. And if not, we can continue with because we have a long queue of questions. Yes? Mridula,
Yeah, so
absolutely.
I don't really have it. Yeah, I don't have anything else to add, but I do want to say that I really like or his response on the micro community that is there between Miss Kilvin and Alyssa. I feel that's extremely interesting, and that was a great point. Thank you. So we can move on to the next question.
Okay, Tong, if that's okay with you. We have a question from Davi. Davi, would you like to ask your question, or should I step in?
I can ask the question.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everyone. Fascinating discussion, truly. It's been wonderful to sit in and listen to you. My question actually comes out of Tanya's fabulous question, because I feel like there's this sort of spontaneous emotional community that's trying to be formed in the novel. I'm not home, I don't have my Mrs. Dalloway with me, but I quickly searched for the battered woman, for instance, in the novel here in my Kindle, right? And for instance, there's this it seems that the emotional regime or the emotional register is so colonial, imperial, gendered, that this other spontaneous emotional community that is trying to get formed through other sounds never really gets formed, like the battered woman singing across the tube station, right? They just break in and they're left behind. This emotional community never really forms. I wonder if you have any thought about it. And Tanya made me think it, right, through her question.
Yeah, if you let me, yes, actually that's also a really good point about which I have had some concerns, because yeah, and the battered woman and much other marginalized characters in Mrs. Dalloway, there are a bunch of them. Yes, also the beggar who is playing music, and also Septimus hears them, and then Peter gives him a penny. So yes, there are lots of them, and yes, it is to me it is also quite a problem to this whole concept, because yes, we cannot say that these communities are successful, that they are built, and maybe this is a kind of a realistic but bitter but realistic viewing of Virginia Woolf, that she tries to build a world where are these connections, and where people could be empathetic towards each other, but yes, there is this zone of marginalized people, to whom, or maybe to whom the communities with whom maybe only on the level of a penny, or like Richard and the woman, yes, in the park, where they just I forgot the word, but it's actually maybe I'll yes, do it quickly. This woman in the park. Okay, maybe I couldn't find, but yes, there's a word that says that there could be a community between Richard and this woman, but in this reality it isn't possible. So it's like maybe like a sparkle. Maybe it was like a sparkle between them, but it couldn't be in reality. Something like this, and maybe also one just a hint. Maybe this all the episode with Elizabeth, when she goes in the city, it is kind of yes, kind of a maybe look in the future in a maybe better future, better reality where the Elizabeth, like her daughter of Mrs. Dalloway, where she is more not empathetic, but maybe less snobbish and more prepared to contact with people from Strand, yes, and so on. Something like this.
Thank you so much. So in David's question, we have this living statue singing for love, as far as I remember. Tong, I love your presentation of statues. Your analysis is so rich, so interesting. Can you comment on that? Okay, so how does statues as the points, do you see any connection between these living statues of a battered woman and the statues that have been marching through the book?
Yeah, I guess that is actually a very interesting point to actually add to my discussion as well. I guess like just to think about this kind of a proper subject, I guess like the battered woman will be deemed by the state as like the improper, something to be removed. So which also be like kind of reflected through Richard's kind of thinking about this kind of making some of the policy there to change the situation there. So I guess if it's from a ideological point there, then it's kind of like there's the statues to be admired and the statues to be removed, or like serving as a bad example to out of sight, get out of sight in the public space. So that's so far what I can think of by joining these two together. So
thank you so much. Rachel was waiting for a very long time to ask a question, so may I ask you, Rachel, if you could?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Really fascinating panel and some really interesting points of overlap with yesterday's panel on Mrs. Dalloway. So if you missed that, I would recommend catching up on that, because I think they talk to each other in quite interesting ways. I'm afraid it's about emotional communities again, but it's such an interesting idea, Georgy, and not a theorization I've come across before. But at the beginning of your paper, when you were talking about that as a kind of theoretical concept and setting up the background to that, I was really struck by a kind of overlap with thoughts from the early 20th century about crowd psychology. And so I was just wondering if that's something that you've thought about at all, or if the critic who's theorizing emotional communities, does she reference that at all? I'm thinking of people like Gustave Le Bon and Wilfred Trotter. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. It's a very, very interesting and good point. As I follow Barbara Rosenwein's works, but as I understand, I did not find there the mention of Gustave Le Bon, more of Lucien Febvre. She is kind of his ideas, but yes, of course, this idea is not. It's not. It hasn't appeared out of nothing. Of course, and of course, there are many other theories that could be analyzed as close to it, and I will do it because personally I also did not dig in this sphere, crowd psychology, but of course I'll do it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not to take anything away from your argument. I just think it could be really fruitful to put them side by side and say.
I agree, totally agree with you.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for a wonderful question. I think that it added another layer here to our discussion. Thank you so much. Tanya, you have been also waiting for asking a question. Still raising a hand. Is it new one? Wonderful.
It's actually not a new question. I'm coming back to the idea of the battered woman, and I haven't read Mrs. Dalloway in a number of years, but I'm remembering, I think she's the character who is outside the subway station singing. Is that right?
Yeah.
So if I remember her character, as she sings, she has like wordless articulations coming out of her mouth. And she's associated with a pre-societal London with the mammoths and the grasses. And I'm almost wondering, she's outside of like traditional society within London. And she's also almost like pre-societal and pre-human historical. And I wonder if that's part of her place. And that's just my comment.
Yeah, that's
Thank
very
you for that.
also comment. And actually, I to maybe also to the theme of the better woman. Actually, she is not. She's almost speechless. Yes, but in the episode with her, there's kind of also kind of a remembering how once she had walked in May and where the sea flows now. So also there goes the theme of also dreams and the sea. So maybe kind of a rhyme also with Clarissa and Lady Bruton, but yes, like a marginalized and pre-societal way. Yeah.
And sorry, but she's a beggar, right? I mean, though she's characterized as a better woman, she will lose gender in the description, right? She has beard. Her voice doesn't articulate sounds. And I think this is truly a voice that's trying to form communities, but can't, right? And I think this is interesting because I think perhaps that distinction you make in the beginning between emotional communities and emotional regime would be interesting here, right? Because I think the regime doesn't allow the spontaneous formation of the community. Right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because emotional. The theory of emotional regime. Yes, it's it is that there is one emotional regime and the emotional refugees. And yes, of course, in this sense, these characters like the battered woman, and other beggars, and the woman in the park, yeah, they are kind of emotional refugees.
Absolutely, and in the chat window, we have wonderful observation from Rachel once again, who observes the link with the years. Absolutely. Do you want to follow up that with a question or?
No, not really.
No.
No. I mean, I guess I was just thinking that we talked a little bit about sound, and in the years, I think of the years as a noisier novel, maybe.
And I think also that Tong's presentation on the statues immediately brings the statue of Edith Cavell in the final scenes of the year. So I have the same impression. Mridula, I have a question for you. As I said, I'm going to ask you about Levinas, also because I thought about Davies' wonderful chapter from the recent Edinburgh Companion that I have the pleasure to edit. He has written about three people who have never met, but in a way communicated through their ideas. So I have a question about meeting with the other, the basic concept of Levinas that I think you also referred to. How do you see this meeting with the other in the context of Mrs. Dalloway?
So are you actually referring to a specific text?
Yes, I think that was a series of lecture in his case, but if you are not familiar with this, that's fine. I just thought that maybe because you used Levinas in your discussion, you would like to follow with that. Okay, that's absolutely fine if you are not ready for that. Okay, you mentioned also this beautiful passage that Tong was also referring to, and maybe I will put that into the chat window, the same quotation. You both referred to Clarissa, Peter, to this quotation when we have the notion of survival. So they both are survivors in a way. And I have a question, how do you read it nowadays after the pandemic? Because since reading Elizabeth Utka, a wonderful book, I tend to read Mrs. Dalloway heavily as pandemic novel. Before that, it was for me mostly the First World War. What about your impression? How do you read this survival theme?
Right. I think that's an interesting question. So I just want to quickly go back to your last question, just to like very briefly respond to it. I did mention about Avinas's conception of the other in my presentation in some details. So I'll just very quickly repeat certain things, which is that the most significant aspect about his theorization of the other is how, how in opposition it is to traditional Western philosophy, which consistently reduces the other to the same by the very power of its theoretical comprehensiveness. So for Levinas, the other actually becomes, again, in relation to the knowing being, the other tends to vanish in a way. So I think that is what I find most interesting about him. I'll quickly move on to your next question, which is about the pandemic novel, right? Mrs. Dalloway as a pandemic novel. I think that's an interesting insight as far as the text is concerned. And I do feel that there are a lot of other, observations that we can also, talk about in relation to the presentation by Tong, because she also talks about the street in the text and street consciousness as well. So personally, I feel that the paragraph that you've shared, which is again something that Tong and I both cited in our own presentations, it's very interesting because I'm absolutely fascinated by the way in which she approaches the streets and ends up, forming different kinds of social communities in her own perception. So to think of that as a pandemic novel, or to think of that that paragraph as something that contributes to our idea of the pandemic novel, is actually a very valuable, very productive thought, primarily because now we talk about these landscapes of isolation and in a way also social alienation. And I feel that Woolf has in a way managed to navigate these two different contrary, at times, realms in a very interesting manner. So maybe Tong would like to add on to that.
Yeah, I just agree with you, Mridula. Like I think like to approach that as a pandemic novel, just to re-engage the death thing, the symbol of death, and also the aging through this, and the gain and loss through the lens of the pandemic will also work as well. Like bringing another layer to the conceptualization of both of our articles. So.
Okay, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, for amazing discussion. We have also a fascinating discussion going on in the chat. So I hope that Reilly could just save kindly the chat for the future generation of Wolfians. I hope it will stay. Thank you so much for amazing meeting and wishing you a wonderful conference. Goodbye.
Yes, thank you very much. Unfortunately, couldn't finish all conversations, but yeah, thank you very much.
But I do hope they will continue.
Yeah, that's right. Bye. Bye.